Before I introduce Dr. John Borelli, I'd like to just take a moment to thank the many people in the background of this lecture event and this lecture series who helped to make it work. I think if you put practical affairs into the hands of professors, that's never a good thing. And so there are a lot of people who are helping us to make this a productive lecture series. First of all, I'd like to just thank Frank Case, who, Father Frank Case, the Vice President for Mission here at Gonzaga, and Raymond Reyes, Dr. Raymond Reyes, who is the Associate Academic Vice President, one of the Associate Academic Vice Presidents, and the Chief Diversity Officer. Those two offices, Diversity and Jesuit Mission, are funding this lecture series. And I think, in a unique way, this year's lecture is, in substance, reflecting that funding stream. An Office of Diversity, as well as an office that looks to educate in mission here at Gonzaga. So that's a nice confluence. Jackie Fulton, the Senior Assistant to the Chair in the Religious Studies Department, has been huge in helping us to make this night happen. So thanks to Jackie. We also have a YouTube channel. If you have interest in these lecture events, we have a YouTube channel where the past, I think, 3 speakers can be found. You can find that YouTube channel on our department website, the Religious Studies website. And of course, I'd like to thank John Borelli as well, who has traveled from Washington, D.C. It's on past 10 p.m. Where you normally live. So thanks so much for being with us tonight. As we approach the 50th anniversary of the close of the Second Vatican Council, and as we sort of survey the dramatic landscape of developments in theology and the church since 1965, I think it is people like John Borelli that we see at the front lines of academic and ecclesial commitment. John has spent a lengthy career, an accomplished career, advancing the mission of the church and the mission of contemporary Catholic theology to be in dialogue with religious neighbors. And importantly, as an academic, he has engaged thoughtfully over many years with the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops, serving as the bishop's associate director of the Secretariat for Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs. 16 years of that. Few scholars, in fact none that come to my mind, have managed to inhabit both the academic and the ecclesial world so well. And so while John will no doubt provide us tonight with a rich experience for which we thank him, we know that he's been doing this for a long time. As he keeps reminding me today, his eldest son is my age. And it's been he's part of a relatively small but now increasing number of theologians who have paved the way for universities like Gonzaga, and professors like me, quite frankly, to embrace the Jesuit ideal of being religious interreligiously. John's position at Georgetown University as a special assistant to the president is unique, and I think represents Georgetown's rather comprehensive commitment to interreligious understanding. I can think of no other institution, Jesuit or otherwise, that has done more to institutionalize this drive for interreligious understanding across multiple academic units and offices. So the commitment can be seen at Georgetown from the very top, in the president's office where John works, and from where he also serves as coordinator of interreligious dialogue for the U.S. Jesuits, but also in the Department of Theology, which currently has one of the leading, if not the leading, graduate program in religious pluralism today in our country. Undergraduate students get to take classes with John on yoga and meditation, and they look like this room. They're filled to capacity. Georgetown's commitment can also be seen in the Alaouite Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding, which has been a prominent instigator of the recent and encouraging acceleration of Muslim-Christian dialogue today by hosting conferences, producing film of events featuring global leaders from Islamic and Christian communities, and producing a steady stream of academic literature, most of which is available online for free, such as the volume on the future of Christian-Muslim relations that John himself edited. in 2007. So over his 40-year career, Dr. Borelli has written 300 or so articles, has had a hand in multiple bishops' documents, and is deservedly proud of the volume he co-authored in 2006 with Archbishop Michael Fitzgerald, and that volume is entitled Interfaith Dialogue, A Catholic View. So for these and surely other reasons, we're privileged this evening to have John Borelli in our midst to discuss 1964, the 50 years ago at Vatican II and the Catholic commitment to interreligious dialogue. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Good. Thank you. Thank you very much, John, for that very generous introduction. So let's get started. We are at a privileged time for understanding what was happening at the Second Vatican Council exactly 50 years ago. Today, Pope Francis, with his vision for a reform of the Church, his preference for reality over ideas, his emphasis on unity, his outreach to all Christians, to Jews, Muslims, and others, especially people living on the margins of societies, his informality, his preference for that, his humor, his way of inspiring everyone reminds us, those of us who remember, of Pope John the 23rd in so many ways. The first pope since St. John the 23rd to be nowhere near Vatican II when it was meeting. Pope Francis has brought new life to the initiatives of that council and embodies its experience, its spirit in so many ways. Here's what he wrote on the 50th anniversary of the death of Pope John. 50 years after his death, the wise and fatherly guidance of Pope John, his love for the Church's tradition and his awareness of the constant need for renewal, his prophetic intuition of the convocation of the Second Vatican Council, and his offering of his life for its success stand as milestones in the history of the Church in the 20th century and as a bright beacon for the journey that lies ahead. The Second Vatican Council, or Vatican II, is foundational for our current self-understanding as Catholics, for our ongoing initiatives, for dialogue, and for any number of themes in Catholic social teaching in our theology, and in everyday life that we hold true and dear to our understanding. Such themes as human dignity, preferential treatment for the poor, the fully conscious and active participation and the laity in the liturgy and in church life, the universal call to holiness, and so many other aspects of Catholic life, including our theme today, the commitment of Catholics to interreligious dialogue. Now, I mentioned his humor. Pope John, too, was a very humorous person. In fact, like Pope Francis, Pope John used to sneak out of the Vatican with his chauffeur. He said, come on, let's get out of here. And he went to visit a professor of his who was at the Hospital of the Holy Spirit. Snuck out to see him because he was hospitalized and not very good shape. So when he went to visit this friend, the nun answering the door, there's the Pope. And she said, oh, Holy Father, I'm the Mother Superior of the Holy Spirit. And he went, wow, lucky you, what a job. I'm just the servant of the servants of God, He was once asked, about how many people work in the Vatican? His answer was about half. He's from a very poor family of farmers up in northern Italy, and he was introducing a talk one evening, and he said, there are 3 ways to lose your money and to go to ruin, lose your money in Italy. Women, gambling, and farming, and my father chose the most boring way. Now, Pope Francis is that way too. A joke that I picked up from Rabbi Skorka, who's his friend from Argentina, the rabbi that he did a book with, when he first met him, they were all there in the cathedral for an event, and he went down the line saying, what's your favorite soccer team? Because in Argentina, everybody has a favorite soccer team, and the Pope's is San Lorenzo, famous for, founded by a priest, and it was very strong in those days, while River Plate was Rabbi Skorka's favorite team. And they were not doing so well. So the next year, they kind of lined up to meet, you know, and he goes down the line. He comes to Skorka, and he says, I think we're going to be eating a lot of, they were so bad, they were nicknamed the Chickens, all right? His Rabbi Skorka's river team. So he comes down the line, and he says, I think we're going to be eating a lot of chicken soup this year. And Skorka was so angry, and he goes, oh, you are beating me with cizaña. It's a Argentinian word for bitter root, and it's like a curse word. It's such evil bitterness you throw at me. And he said this. The papal nuncio is there, and he goes, Rabbi, we're in the cathedral. And Pope Francis, Archbishop Bergoglio says to the nuncio, we're talking soccer. Oh, well, soccer, go ahead, you know, anything you want to say. So, a man with great humor. Two initial points that I wished, that I wish to make here from the beginning. I'll explain who these people are as we go along, but the seated man is Cardinal Augustin Bea, who engineered this whole document on the Jews into interreligious dialogue. And that's Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, a very famous Orthodox rabbi in American history. Two initial points I want to make here. Interreligious relations, including relations with Jews, were conceptualized within ecumenical relations, that is, relations with other Christians during the council. That's how they arose. Out of our relationship with other Christians, the same office was able to develop this text, this revolutionary text on the Jews. And the second point is Vatican II was only a beginning. I've been saying this. One thing, it's a nice thing to have Professor Shevlin, you know, welcome me out here because I get to meet so many in the audience ahead of time in the classes and everything. But I was saying this today. We're at the 50-year mark. It was only a beginning. This was so new, we were just beginning. And so we're at the 50-year mark, and we're looking to a new era. We're looking to a new era. So it's trajectories. The trajectory is more important than the facts of what happened 50 years ago. But let us return now to 1964 to understand how the commitment of Catholics to interreligious dialogue emerged out of the council. That year was critically important, and so that will be our lens for the eventual document on interreligious dialogue. Its future was very much in doubt. This is Pope Paul VI, who was returning, who took a trip to the Holy Land, his pilgrimage to the Holy Land, at the beginning of 1964. The future of the text was very much in doubt at that point. But at the close of the year, in early December, he made a journey to India. Now, these journeys of the Pope outside of Italy were a new matter too, something new for Catholics. So he goes to the Holy Land and he goes to India. And in that year, between these two trips, a considerable amount happened in the commitment of the Catholic Church to interreligious dialogue. This will be our lens, 1964, for reflecting on Vatican II, interreligious dialogue, and the commitment of Catholics and these Jesuit institutions that we all belong to dialogue. The year 1964 was the third of 4 years when the council met. It met in St. Peter's Basilica, as this typical photo is of. Vatican II met from 1962 to 1965 over 4 fall terms, from either late September until October or early October until November or December. I was in my junior and senior years of high school and my freshman and sophomore years of college during those years. Vatican II was an event in the full sense of the word, more than just an historical occurrence. It was a confluence of several streams within the Catholic Church that took on a life of its own, very much like a river. And so it no one was really very much in control of it. And several things developed over the course of those 4 years while the council met that were very much unpredictable. It was announced on the 25th of January 1959 by Pope John, who was elected just a few months earlier on the 28th of October 1958. Preparations had begun in 1959 and in earnest midway through 1960 with the naming of the preparatory bodies still more than 2 years in advance of the opening. Even so, with all the preparatory work, by 2 October 1964, this day, 50 years ago, we were not even halfway through the council, though we were halfway through the periods when the council met. Pope John called the council for the enlightenment, edification, and joy of the entire Christian people. And secondly, for a renewed, cordial invitation to the faithful of the separated churches to participate. All right. By this time, in 1964, only 2 of the Council's 16 documents had been passed: the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy and the Decree on the Means of Social Communication. We were just at the beginning of the second session, and only 3 documents would be passed at that time: the Dogmatic Constitution on the Church, the Decree on Catholic Eastern Churches, and the Decree on Ecumenism. Look how many came out in 65. So just in terms of numbers of documents, we weren't halfway through the council as the third period was beginning to open. A lot more had to be accomplished. But the documents themselves are not something we should solely look at when we think of Vatican II. The larger criterion are the acts of Vatican II. The 16 documents were in fact acts of Vatican II, like this one document we're looking at on interreligious dialogue. But there were other acts that took place during the council that were very much a part of the council. Just looking at 1964, among the, I think, about a dozen other acts that we could attribute that belonged to the council, was when Paul VI created a secretariat for non-Christians. He already had a secretariat for Christian unity to work on the ecumenical dimensions, other Christians. But on Pentecost Sunday in 1964, he created another secretariat for other believers. That was an act of the council. It's embedded within the council. On the 6th of August, Paul VI releases his first encyclical on the church, Ecclesiam Suum. In it, he will use the word dialogue over 70 times. Even though it's a papal act, an encyclical, it's very much embedded in the council, where the whole concept of dialogue was being introduced into the Catholic Church. So it's very much a part of the acts of the council. There are others, but about this time next year will be the 50th anniversary of when Paul VI addressed the General Assembly of the United Nations, which was an extraordinary event. And he himself, when he returned to Italy from this, went right to the council and said, I went to the United Nations representing you. So it was an act of the council. So there are a number of things. You just can't look at 16 documents that are published and preserved in certain form. You got to look at all else that was going on at the time of the council. Now, one memorable event that took place on the Pope's trip to the Holy Land was his meeting with other Christian leaders, particularly his embrace with the Patriarch of Constantinople, Patriarch Athenagoras. Paul VI described his trip to the Holy Land as a personal pilgrimage. The third period was ending, in November 1963, no, on 4 December 1963, the Pope came to the council. He gave a concluding speech before everybody went home. It was not in the printed text. And he said, and finally, let me tell you, I'm going to fulfill my life's dream, something I realized would be possible soon after I was elected. I'm going to the Holy Land in January. And the council stood up and gave a thunderous applause. That was totally unexpected. So he goes, right away, Athenagoras writes him and said, we have to have a meeting with Christian leaders. He wanted this to be a personal pilgrimage, the Pope did. But this embrace on the Mount of Olives between the Pope and Patriarch was one of the extraordinary events, a sign of efforts of restoring Christian unity, Church East and West. This year, on May 25th, Pope Francis and Patriarch Bartholomew reenacted this event. They said at the time, they acknowledged the importance of the embrace of their predecessors after many centuries of silence, and it paved the way for many momentous gestures. But on that pilgrimage, Paul VI did something else. He went to Bethlehem. And for the first time that I'm aware of, a pope addressed Jews and Muslims as Jews and Muslims. This is often overlooked. May the world surrounding us receive today in the name of Jesus Christ our respectful and affectionate greetings. We address this reverent greeting in particular to those who profess monotheism, and with us direct their religious worship to the one true God, most high and living, the God of Abraham, the supreme God whom Melchizedek, a mysterious person about whose genealogy and Scripture tells us nothing, but whose regal priesthood Christ himself wishes to be characterized one day, distinct in the past, but recalled in the Bible and in the Missal, celebrating as God Most High, maker of heaven and earth, especially to those who worship the God of Abraham. So this was an extraordinary kind of move. Paul VI had far less experience in Muslim lands than John the 23rd. So there you see their overlapping years. John the 23rd contracted cancer and died on June 3rd, 1963. So he only lived through the first period of the council. Montini was the Archbishop of Milan, and he was elected Paul VI, and he carried on until 1978. John the 23rd had been apostolic visitor to Bulgaria from 1925 to 1934, and then apostolic delegate to Turkey. So he was experienced in Muslim lands. On the other hand, Giovanni Battista Montini, Paul VI, the future pope, who had decades of service in the Roman Curia before he was Archbishop of Milan, was a friend of the renowned Muslim Catholic scholar of Islam, Louis Massignon. He knew him very well. In fact, Louis Massignon had encouraged what he called Badaliya prayer groups. Badaliya in Arabic means both substitution and accompaniment. And the idea was that Christians would gather on Fridays when Muslims had their noonday prayer and would pray to God for Muslims. And there was such a Badaliya group that met in Rome, which Paul VI, when he worked in the Curia as Archbishop Montini, used to attend. So he was already attending these. So he already had this tendency to want to reach out to Muslims. 3 months before going to announcing that he was going to the Holy Land, Paul VI had already indicated the direction he wanted the council to go. when he gave his opening talk to the second period, 1963, as Pope. The Catholic Church looks into the distance beyond the confines of the Christian horizon. How could she place limits on her love if this very love is to be that of God the Father, who showers his favor upon everyone, and who so loved the world that he gave his only Son? Look, therefore, beyond your own sphere. He's telling the bishops, look beyond your sphere. Observe those other religions that uphold the meaning and the concept of God as one creator, provident, most high, and transcendent, that worship God with acts of sincere piety, and upon whose beliefs and practices the principles of moral and social life are founded. So he already gave a hint. I mean, this had to surprise a lot of bishops. He's what? What's the Pope saying? Of course, he was speaking in Latin, and a lot of them had to kind of brush up on their Latin at the time. But they got the message. He's asking us, it's enough for us to look to other Christians, and we have a bunch of them gathered here. But what the heck, you know? Well, he got back, 1964, the critical year, from the Holy Land, and he received a letter from the Archbishop of Chicago, not the Archbishop designate, who you all know, who will be leaving you soon, but Cardinal Albert Meyer of Chicago. I write because of my concern for the proposed chapters 4 and 5 on the decree on ecumenism. Without those two chapters, the chapter on the Jews and on religious liberty, the cause of the Catholic Church in the United States, I am afraid, will greatly suffer. The whole credibility of the council in the eyes of Americans, the Archbishop of Chicago was telling the Pope, depends on those two, at the time, final chapters of the decree on the draft on ecumenism, on the Jews and on religious liberty. Similar letters from Cardinal Cushing of Boston and Cardinal Ritter of St. Louis were received. As I said, the Pope called the council for ecumenical reasons from the start, renewal of the church and to reach out to other Christians. For renewal of the church, he created a secretariat for promoting Christian unity. And here are the 4 original members. That's Cardinal Bea to the left of Pope John. Pope John's the one in white, right? And to the right is Monsignor Villebrands, who would be president of this secretariat for many more years. Cardinal Bea would pass away in 1967. Getting this through the council pretty much exhausted him, and he was already in his 80s. Villebrands would then take care of it. This man right here is an American. His name is Thomas Stransky. It looks like a deer in headlights there. 30 years old at the time. This is taken in January 1961. First of all, the Secretariat was a new office, and they gave it just an old set of apartments for its offices. They were using the bathtub for files. They didn't have a filing cabinet. And they said, the Holy Father wants to visit you. They sent the advance man. What a dump. You can't receive the Holy Father here. Got a nice parlor upstairs. That's where you receive him. So this is not their office. They have borrowed parlor. And the Pope was such a down-to-earth man. Bea had a whole agenda. They had their first meeting of the Secretariat, and they gathered the bishops. And he had a whole agenda. And the Pope sits down. He said to Stransky, you're from Wisconsin, right? Yeah. From a farm? Yeah. Did you have pigs? Yeah, we had pigs. Good. You know, my brother's having trouble with his pigs. And chickens. You have chickens? How do you get them to lay in the winter? You know, and Bea's looking over at Stransky. We're talking livestock with the Pope, and I want to talk. And the Pope turns to Bea and he says, look, I can't help you. Carve out your territory. Seize the ground. Make yourself known. When the time is right, I'll intervene. So a truly wise man. So the Pope says it will be called Vatican II. In May, over 2,000 responses to questionnaires from bishops and heads of religious orders and so forth. And on the 5th of June, 1960, he announces 10 commissions. and a Secretariat for Christian Unity. So this is the body initially, and then it's expanded to other staff as the years go on, that took us through the council. For the enlightenment, edification, and joy of the entire Christian people, for a renewed cordial invitation to the faithful of separated churches to participate. So is the Secretariat only a PR group that's going to take care of the visitors, or will it prepare its own propositions for study? By the 25th of December, 61, when the Pope had the solemn convocation of the council, the solemn invitation, come next October and let's begin, you could discern three different goals for the spiritual renewal of the church. And it's often through ressourcement, a French word, to recover our tradition for renewal. For appropriate adaptation of the church discipline to the needs and condition of our times, to the modern world. In Italian, this was aggiornamento, updating. And for the furtherance of Christian unity, ecumenism. So notice how ecumenism stays very much. Well, how did this document get on the agenda on the Jews then, initially? In June of 1960, no sooner had Pope John announced the preparatory commissions and a Secretariat for Christian Unity, and that Cardinal Augustin Bea, who by the way is a Jesuit, is a German Jesuit, a scripture scholar, would be its head. He had an appointment on June 13th, 8 days later, with an esteemed scholar, Jules Isaac, a Frenchman, Jules Isaac. Who was Jules Isaac? Well, he was a Holocaust survivor. He was a hero of Verdun of the First World War in the French army. He was Minister of Education for the French government. In fact, if you went to high school in France, you would have read his textbook in French history. But with the fall of France, he was removed. He and his family fled to Provence, south of France. He's Jew. And there in Provence one day in Aix, his wife was arrested. He came home after taking a walk. There was a note, I'm at the police station, join me. His daughter and son-in-law were also arrested. They didn't survive. He didn't go. He went under hiding. And he survived because people hid him. And he decided during that time to explore how it is that we got to this point in European history that Jews are being hunted down and exterminated. And he came up with some studies, and he came up with this thesis of a teaching of contempt, a Christian teaching of contempt. After the war, he, rather than being a bitter man, he began reaching out with Christians and was part of a whole movement of Jews and Christians to get this on the church's agenda. He founded the Amitié Judéo-Chrétienne in France, the Jewish Christian Friendship Society. And so this appointment was set up for 30 minutes, and he says to Pope, have a commission investigate the teaching of contempt. And the Pope said, I think you could hope for more than you believe. I thought of the idea when you walked in the room. I want you to see Cardinal Bea. And so now it was on the agenda. 3 80-year-old men in 1960, and that's how it got on the agenda. By September of 63, only one of them was alive, Cardinal Bea. The other two were dead. So this may not have ever happened without that meeting. Carve out a role at Vatican II, he told the Secretariat. Have unprecedented ecumenical proposals for the council. Bea told Stransky, nope, we're not going to do what we did last year. It's never been done before. Draft a statement on religious liberty, because the early meetings with other Christians pretty much convinced them that they had to say something on religious liberty. It's not enough to say we want to dialogue with other Christians. What do you think about What do you think about religious liberty? And exploring relations with Jews in preparation for Vatican II. Dialogue, a key word. It's not in the history of the church. You won't find it up until this point. You search all the documents. The first time it was used was in the first draft of the Decree on Ecumenism in terms of our relationship with other Christians. Nothing is able to bring this about better than dialogue. And they had this Latin word, dialogus, with our separated brethren, whereby the condition in which our communion really exists becomes more clearly known. That's the first time it was used in any text of high standing in the Catholic Church, this draft, Decree on Ecumenism, November 1963. The draft on ecumenism presented to the Council in November of 63 had 5 chapters. Principles of Catholic ecumenism, the practice of ecumenism, churches and ecclesial communities. Then chapter 4, on relations with other Christians. Above all, relations of Catholics to non-Christians, above all to the Jews. And number 5 on religious liberty. This is how that chapter 4 began. Since the common heritage of the church with the synagogue is so great, this Holy Synod intends in every way to foster and commend mutual understanding and esteem, which is the fruit of theological studies and fraternal conversations. The word for conversations used there, not dialogues, colloquies. When Vatican II says this Holy Synod intends, it says, listen up, this is very important. We're going to promote this, it says. Paul VI in Ecclesiam Suum, which came out in 64, used the word colloquium, colloquia, to this internal drive of charity which seeks expression to the external gift of charity, we will apply the word dialogue. And he uses it many other places. The church must enter into dialogue with the world in which it lives. It has something to say, a message to give, a communication to make. So, 5 documents on the council actually became key to promoting dialogue. Not only the decree, the eventual declaration on the relation of the church to non-Christian religions, but a decree on missionary activity, a declaration on religious liberty, and the final document, the Pastoral Constitution in the modern world. In March 23rd, the support for the decree on ecumenism, the first 3 chapters, was so strong. I think the vote was 2,088 in favor of it and 80 votes against it. They were too timid. They only used the word dialogue 3 times. So in March, they go back, there it is, 2052 to 86 votes. And they strengthen it. They use dialogue 12 times in the final text. They were too timid. They thought the council was a little uncertain. They worked on the chapters, and they made the 2 final chapter appendices, separate declarations. They attempted to draft a paragraph on Islam to go with on the Jews. So this is how they began the year. Now, the fact that they decided to make it a declaration very quickly, there were 3 kinds of documents at Vatican II: constitutions, decrees, and declarations. 4 constitutions which were quite significant on liturgy, the church, revelation, and the church in the modern world. 9 decrees, one of which was ecumenism, and 3 declarations. What is a declaration is what is no longer in a decree. That's all it is. No one should ever say that a declaration is a mere declaration, that this eventual text was called a declaration. It's not a mere declaration. You have to take Vatican II as a whole, all the acts and all the documents. And so that was very much a part of what needed to be said. And so what these three declarations are material that were spun off of decrees. That's all. You read the minutes of the council, that's what they intended. So in April, the Central Planning Commission decides to make Chapter 4 on the Jews and on non-Christians a separate declaration. By the 17th of May, Paul VI announces a secretariat for non-Christians. And he says, let no pilgrim, no matter how distant he is from this Rome, ever feel that he's a complete stranger in this city. It's very eloquent what he said. In August, he puts out his encyclical Ecclesiam Suum and uses dialogue 70 times. It looks like all the chips are in favor of this statement on interreligious dialogue. But in fact, it had very troubled waters ahead of it. 1964, there was as many as 8 drafts of this text. It would be eventually the shortest text of the council, 8 different drafts that it passed through. And it was in many ways the document most debated outside the council and the least debated inside. Most debated in the public arena. As Cardinal Meyer of Chicago was trying to say, our whole credibility in the United States depended on this and the one on religious liberty. If these fail, the cause of the Catholic Church in the United States is going to be pretty much damaged, our credibility. So at some point, somebody leaked an unauthorized draft on the Jews and non-Christians to the New York Herald Tribune and the New York Times. And 2 big problems were immediately picked up by the Jews with this draft. They saw that this word deicide, the horrible charge that Christians used to hurl at Jews, which was in the first draft, was no longer in it. And they felt like that it needed to be in it. And secondly, the way dialogue appears in the text, it's as though dialogue is urged to fulfill the Christian hope for the entry of all Israel into the fullness of the people of God, the way the wording was. It looked like dialogue was simply what we were doing with Jews in time, waiting for them to become Christians. Rabbi Heschel, whose picture I showed to you earlier, made the statement, if conversion is the point of dialogue with Catholics, then I would more gladly line up for Auschwitz than enter into dialogue. It's a rather strong statement by a man who lost much of his family in Auschwitz. Who were those that were very much against the draft? There was a minority at Vatican II. You can't talk about the bishops as liberal and conservative as much as we want to. There was a majority, a big majority in all the votes of bishops who wanted these changes to take place. And then there was a minority who were resisting, a small minority, many of which were officials in the Curia. There were bishops from the Middle East. You can't say anything about Jews unless you say something about Islam. And any statement about Jews is support for the state of Israel. Remember, this is 1960s, and the Middle East dominated our foreign policy in the United States as much as it does today. And an early draft on the Jews was removed from the council agenda because Muslim governments said this is a disguised support for the state of Israel. And Bea says, we're just trying to do a religious text, not a political text. Well, the Middle East bishops say we need more than that. You got to say something about Islam, and we got to be careful in the language. Bishops from Asia and Africa were saying something different. We have majority populations of Hindus and Buddhists, animists in Africa, we've got to mention them. We can't just have the text as it is. Bishops wanting more strongly worded text. There were those who were quite angry deicide was wiped out of it, and they wouldn't vote for it unless deicide was put back in. And Jewish leaders who did not like the wording. Not only that, well, despite all of that, Cardinal Bea, when he shows up to present the text in September of '64, receives a standing ovation from the council. So clearly his Secretariat for Christian Unity were very popular with the bishops. They hear loud and clear, we got to expand the document, we're going to expand it and add other chapters, very clearly. And they set to work. On October 9th, he receives a letter from the Secretary of the Council who says, we have decided that the text on the Jews should now be a part of the text on the church. We should break it up. What you say about anti-Semitism and hatred can go in a later text on the church in the modern world, and the text on the church mentions the Jews. So we're going to break it up. So Bea fights back. It gets the Pope on his side. So for a brief period there of about a week, it was uncertain who was in charge of the text and if it would last at all. And he won the fight, and he got charge of the text again. So it almost disappeared by maneuvering on the council floor. 14th of September, Rabbi Heschel and Zacharias Schuster visit Pope Paul to voice concerns about changes in the text. The 7th of October, leading members of the minority attempt to break up the draft into various parts. I just told you that. October 9th, meantime, the Secretariat gets 4 experts on Islam, missionaries, people with expertise, to write a paragraph on Muslim. Bea counterattacks, drawing support from the Pope, additional references to Hinduism and Buddhism, the religious response to human enigmas, composed by Yves Congar, one of the great thinkers of the Council, Charles Moller, Joseph Neuner, a Jesuit in India, as Paul Pfister, a Jesuit from Japan. And Cardinal Koenig of Austria. The last 3 names, Neuner, Pfister, and Koenig, were all Austrians. Neuner was in India, and he came to Rome with the Indian bishops, and Pfister was in Sophia University in Tokyo, and he came to Rome for the council as an expert with the bishops from Japan. Koenig reached out to them and said, we need your expertise. Would you help us write some sentences on Hinduism and Buddhism? That's how it got done. So there's so many streams. You just can't begin to imagine. You've got the people working in Christian-Jewish relations from the start. You've got people, scholars of Islam, trying to promote Islam at the council. All kinds of maneuvers going on. By November, they represented the text to the council, and it looks like the final document that we know. A chapter on a part on the unity of humanity and the profound enigmas of life that religions address, the religious responses in general in Hinduism and Buddhism, Catholic responses to these to recognize, preserve, and foster what is true and holy, and dialogue with members of other religions. A chapter on Muslim, a chapters on Jews, and condemnation of discrimination. So only by November of '64 did the draft begin to look like the final text of Nostra Aetate, which some of you have studied. We're not going to spend too much time on this. Let me just say the points that it makes about Muslims in the third part. It voices the church's esteem for Muslims. Why? They adore the one God. They strive to submit wholeheartedly to the decrees, God's decrees, just as Abraham, with whom their faith is gladly linked, submitted to God. Sorry about that. They revere Jesus as a prophet. They honor Mary. They look forward to the day of judgment. They worship God, especially through prayer, almsgiving, and fasting. Then, I think the greatest understatement in the conciliar texts. In the course of centuries, there have arisen not a few quarrels and hostilities between Christians and Muslims. But then we call this sacred synod pleads, so there's that language again. This sacred synod pleads, forget the past, make sincere efforts for mutual understanding, and work together for social justice, moral welfare, peace, and freedom of all. So, this is an artist rendition of what a meeting of religious leaders would look like. And why interreligious dialogue? Only sort of coming out as people reflected more and more. Friendship and preserving what is true and holy. Joint action and cooperation for justice and the common good. Reconciliation and mutual exploration. Mutual understanding and respect. Spiritual companionship and growth in relationship with God. And understanding our common spiritual heritage. So, and at the end of the year, the Pope travels to Mumbai today, and quotes a Hindu text in his speech, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Didn't have space to write the whole title, but it's one of the Upanishads. So the Pope so he starts out the year in the Middle East, very tentatively addressing monotheists. And in December, he's in Bombay quoting the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. It shows you what a significant year it was. This visit to India is the fulfillment of a long-cherished desires. Yours is a land of ancient culture, the cradle of great religions, the home of a nation that has sought God with a relentless desire. In deep meditation and silence, there's the plug for yoga and meditation, and in hymns of fervent prayer, rarely has this longing for God been expressed with words so full of the spirit of Advent. He was there in early December, our Advent. As in the words written in your sacred books many centuries before Christ, from the unreal lead me to the real, from darkness lead me to light, from death lead me to immortality. Conclusion. Gonzaga University is a Jesuit university, if you didn't know, and I think you all know. It's one of 28 in the United States. Ignatius of Loyola and the companions, 16th century. You know, one of the Ignatian features of their spirituality is you begin with gratitude, be grateful. Be attentive to your past and present life. Be reflective on the gospel in your life, and be active in deciding the future. Contemplation and action. So it was these early Jesuits, because of the flow of religious events, the Portuguese developing ships and going around Africa, that they got on board and they went on journeys to Asia. Francis Xavier, Matteo Ricci to China, Roberto de Nobili. Matteo Ricci dressed like a Confucian. Robert de Nobili dressed like a sannyasin, a renouncer in the Hindu tradition. So what Nostra Aetate was talking about reflected very much what these early Jesuit missionaries long ago were trying to do, but the church pulled back from that. The church pulled back from that. During 1965, the final year from the council, the Jesuits were holding their General Congregation 31. The Jesuits do business in what are called general congregations. So up until Vatican II, they had 30. And in 31, they fully embraced the commitment to ecumenism. They made a slight reference to dialogue with non-Christian is now more urgent and universal. And they recognized the need for greater cooperation with the laity. So 3 things. They committed themselves to ecumenism right away. They acknowledged that they needed to think more about relations with non-Christians, and they needed lay collaborators. General Congregation 32 came in the 70s, and that's when they made their commitment to social justice as essential to the mission of the Society of Jesus. Pope Francis attended that as the provincial from Argentina as part of that, and reiterated the commitment to dialogue. General Congregation 33 acknowledged that even as we consider these things, we observe other signs of the times that encourage us and give us hope. There is throughout the world a heightened sense of a solidarity of the human family and a rising consciousness, especially among the young, that conditions of misery and oppression cannot be tolerated. The Church, enlivened by the Second Vatican Council and expressing itself in a new forms of community and parish life, is more and more engaged in the works of peace and justice. Many of the world's religions and cultures are experiencing a new vitality, and there are indications of a growing search for meaning, sometimes expressed through more profound reflections on prayer. So that commitment. But it was 34 in 95 that gave us our theme. To be religious today is to be interreligious. So this full support in 1995 to Interreligious, that essential to the mission of whatever is Jesuit is the promotion of interreligious dialogue. One of the great minds of Vatican II was the Dominican theologian Father Yves Congar. Almost immediately after the close of Vatican II, he reflected on the major consequence of missing the point of Vatican II and looking just at the words, just at the text of the Council, and losing sight of the trajectories. Thus, this is what he said on 13 December 1965, just a few days after the Council closed. The danger is that one will not seek anymore, but will simply exploit an inexhaustible warehouse of Vatican II. Then a post-Vatican era would open up much the way of a post-Tridentine era existed after the Council of Trent, a long period of no change, no renovation. It would be a betrayal of the aggiornamento, that word I gave you in the beginning, the updating of the Church to modern times. If we thought we could fix it once and for all in the texts of Vatican II. We are at the 50-year mark. This year was critical for the survival of interreligious dialogue, and it survived. And it became this lively text. And it was only a beginning. All of us were just kind of, where do we go from here? And exploring new ways. Fortunately, the Jesuit institutions where most of you are being educated now committed themselves to this too. So it's really for you. For 50 years, I was, maybe when you're 68 and can look at people and say, well, 50 years ago, I was at Gonzaga, and we were very much committed to be religious today is to be interreligious. And we heard somebody who can remember what it was like before the Council and what happened there, and even worked with somebody who worked at the Council. And where will we be then? Where will you take the trajectory? What will you be handing off to that next generation? That's something to think about as we look at these 50-year marks. You think of the 50th anniversary of your grandparents, say, and they like to recall what it was like 50 years ago. But then you look at the fullness of the family around them and all the benefits that have happened. Well, that's where we are now. And it's for the youth to carry this on, to really explore what it means to be religious today is to be interreligious. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John.
Yeah.
This is a wonderful talk, I think, in so many different ways. I want to get out of the way. He's willing to have some question and answer time with you all. I just want to say, I think that where we are in our historical moment, we have never had more information at our grasp, and yet this information is falling away. This granular level of detail around the Council and its implications, right? The ways in which things were contingent, things could have happened, the way they did, and they did, or they could have happened in fundamentally different ways. And we would potentially not be here in this room this evening. So this is a gift, I think, to reacquaint with the historical record at this level of detail. And you have to publish that book with Stransky.
Get it out.
Jesuit with the deer in the headlights.
Paulist, American Paulist.
Paulist, yeah. So that has to come out. Otherwise, we're not going to have this kind of information the way we should. I failed to mention that we have with us this evening a former speaker in this lecture series. Venerable Geshe Pelge is with us. He has spoken here at Gonzaga many times over the years. And for 2 years, he was a global scholar in residence with us, teaching classes in Buddhism and the religions of Asia. And he's defected, sadly, to Eastern Washington University. Where, he teaches even more than he did here for us. So here we are, a moment of sort of implicit dialogue. Thanks so much for coming this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Comments, questions, observations?
Yes.
So in the Vatican II, there are 3 types of articles, right? The constitutions, the decrees, and
3 kinds of documents, right.
what's the difference between the decrees and not the constitution, the third?
Okay, again, we had 3 kinds of documents: constitutions and decrees and declarations. Now, John O'Malley, who's an historian of the council, is of the opinion that the council fathers created their own nomenclature and their own language at Vatican II. So their own way of identifying these documents. One of the things the council did not do that previous councils did was issue canons. They would make a statement of doctrine, and then they would say, anyone who does not accept them, let them be anathema, let them be condemned. So they chose not to use that language, but they chose to use a more engaging language, a language of dialogue, a pastoral language, a language of reaching out to the modern world. So the second period, everyone knew that we were going to change the liturgy. There had been a liturgical movement. So the liturgy text flowed through the council a little smoothly, very smoothly. So by the end of the second period, it was ready to be voted on, and they called it a constitution. But they had another document on social communication, which is probably the most unmemorable of all the 16 documents, wouldn't you agree, those who know them? So they couldn't call it a constitution, so they called it a decree. So they're working with those. We have constitutions, we have decrees. So then they get to the end of the second period, and the decree on ecumenism did very well. The bishops really liked those. In fact, they didn't have time to debate the chapter on the Jews or religious liberty. They spent all their time talking about ecumenism. That worried Jewish leaders. Does that mean it's off the agenda? And that's probably why Cardinal Meyer sent his letter. We've got to have those 2 chapters. But since the first 3 on ecumenism were so well received by such a huge vote, they knew it was ready to go, but those 2 chapters would weigh it down. So they made them appendices, and then the Central Committee said, no, let them be separate declarations. They just came up with this. So it was just what's no longer in a decree is in a declaration. That doesn't mean it's less important. You'll find important statements of the council in all levels. But they just, this is part of the life of its own. The council took on a life of its own, so this was just decided. But they all agreed you got to take it as a whole, not just the 16 documents, but all that happened. One of the things they did at the very close of the council, because of the embrace of Athenagoras and Paul VI, the very last day of the council, they lifted the condemnations between Rome and Constantinople that had been in place since 1054. And it was announced, it was read, and the council fathers stood up and applauded. It's an act of the council, even though So this decree of the lifting of the anathemas, but it's not counted among the 16 texts. So you got to, Paul VI said, you got to take it as a whole, all that happened. So that's, now, we grant that the 4 constitutions are like pillars. The church in the modern world, huge document on social justice, Catholics in political life, all that. The Constitution on the liturgy, huge change in the way Catholics worship, which has that famous passage, the full active conscious participation of the laity in the liturgical life of the church. Divine revelation, Karl Barth thought it was the weakest of the texts because it still didn't clarify scripture and tradition. But it was an important document, and the one on the church. In a way, they serve as pillars, but you can only understand the document on the church in light of the document on ecumenism, in light of the document on interreligious dialogue. And you fully understand the document on the church in the modern world with the document on religious liberty and the document on interreligious dialogue. They're like commentaries. They're like implementations of those. In fact, Paul VI said, let the decree on ecumenism be the ecumenical commentary on the church constitution. So again, Constitution decree, it was almost arbitrary. What's not as important as this Constitution we'll call a decree, but they all were called decrees from the start, or drafts. And then a declaration was a spinoff. So, yes. Any other questions? Yes.
When we're looking at to be religious today is to be interreligious, I'm wondering how that message can get across to, since 1965, in the world there's been a lot of conflict, as
Yes.
we say, and I'm just trying to think, how is there a way to bring in more people into that conversation that currently are not?
I simply think by doing it and embodying it, and make this a part of your life. Nothing engages people better than actually doing it and making it your style. I think that's what Pope Francis does. What reality is more important than ideas, he said. He lives that life. I mean, I'm going to the Holy Land. I want my best friend rabbi and my best friend Muslim from Argentina to go with me. So that's the first thing, is figure out how you're going to do it and make it how you do it. Make it a part of your life. We live as spiritual companions with one another, and my experience is that people have been strengthened in their faith through interreligious dialogue rather than weakened. So I think that's the best way to go about it. Begin with yourself, embody it, make it not just for experts, those people like Professor Shevlin who study this, and have the facts, but make it part of how we live. So, others here? Questions? You've been seated all very quietly all this time. Anyone else? Well, it's quiet. One way to have standing room only is just shift classrooms, right? And get a smaller room. So there's a trick to take away. There's one takeaway point, So.
Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Borelli. So those of you like this gentleman with interest in sort of the scenes today where dialogue can be transformative of wounded communities, be in touch with your faculty here. Let us know the kinds of topics you would like to hear experts like Dr. Borelli lecture on. We do this every year, and so your faculty is willing and happy to hear from you as to where you think we need to be addressing questions to do with dialogue today. So, thanks very much.
Thank you.